Update 3. My boyfriend's mother pretended to have dementia to test me, so I played her game and watched her forget which lies she told. He'd had nightmares about watching her decline and losing her to a disease that stole her personality piece by piece. He'd researched long-term care, power of attorney, and end-of-life planning, and all of it had been theater designed to test his girlfriend. Judith said she'd done it because she loved him and wanted to protect him. But Ethan shook his head and said love didn't justify manipulation and psychological torture. He told her that Cassidy had actually passed her test with honors, showing patience and kindness and dedication throughout the entire ordeal. But in passing the test, she'd proven the test itself was cruel and unnecessary. Judith tried another approach, softening her voice and reaching for Ethan's hand. She said she'd made mistakes in execution, but the principle was sound, that any woman willing to marry her son should be willing to care for his family in sickness and health. Ethan pulled his hand away and said that commitment should be proven through natural circumstances over time, not through elaborate manipulation schemes. He said the trust fund clause in her will had been particularly disgusting, using money to incentivize care while holding financial threats over his head if his wife ever showed normal human frustration. Judith's expression shifted to something calculating as she pointed out that I'd apparently been tracking and documenting her behavior for weeks without telling Ethan, that I'd been running my own deception operation while claiming moral superiority. She asked how that was any more ethical than her test. I'd been waiting for this deflection and had my response prepared. I explained that I'd documented her behavior to protect myself and Ethan from her manipulation, that I'd gathered proof before making accusations so there could be no ambiguity about the truth. Her deception had been designed to control and manipulate. Mine had been designed to expose and prevent that control. Judith stood and said we were all being dramatic, that families tested each other all the time, and this was no different. Ethan asked if she'd tested his father like this before they married. And Judith hesitated just long enough to reveal the answer was yes. Gregory had mentioned years ago in passing that his mother-in-law had created elaborate scenarios to test his worthiness, but he'd laughed it off as a quirky family tradition. Now, those stories took on sinister context. Ethan asked what other tests she'd run on him throughout his life, what other situations she'd manufactured to evaluate his character and choices. Judith refused to answer, and Ethan said her silence was answer enough. He told his mother that he loved her but couldn't trust her anymore, that she'd damaged their relationship, possibly beyond repair. He said he needed time and space to process the betrayal and decide how to move forward. Judith said if he walked out that door choosing me over her, she'd know she'd been right about me all along, that I was manipulative and determined to isolate him from his family. The emotional blackmail was blatant and desperate. Ethan looked at his mother with something close to pity and said she'd isolated herself by betraying everyone's trust. We left together and I heard something crash against the door behind us as we walked to the car. Ethan was silent during the drive back to my apartment, processing everything that had happened. When we got inside, he sat on my couch and put his head in his hands. He said he felt like he'd never actually known his mother, that he was questioning every interaction they'd ever had and wondering what had been genuine versus manipulative. I sat next to him and said I was sorry he was going through this, that discovering a parent's capacity for deception was one of the worst betrayals possible. Ethan asked if I was angry at him for not believing me initially, and I said I understood why he'd been skeptical, that doubting your parents' serious illness diagnosis based on a girlfriend's suspicions would have been irresponsible. He said most girlfriends would have run away after discovering the test rather than documenting it systematically. And I pointed out that most mothers didn't fake dementia to evaluate their sons' partners. Over the next week, the family's situation deteriorated further. Gregory filed for legal separation, citing emotional abuse and breach of trust. The separation papers detailed not just the dementia deception, but a pattern of manipulative behavior throughout their marriage that Gregory had tolerated or rationalized for decades. Judith called Ethan repeatedly, alternating between apologizing and blaming me for destroying their family. Ethan stopped answering after she left a voicemail saying I'd obviously been planning this from the beginning, that a normal person wouldn't have thought to document everything unless they'd been scheming all along. The circular logic was absurd. She'd created a test that required me to be suspicious and strategic to detect, then used my suspicious and strategic response as proof I was manipulative. Her own methodology had trapped her in a paradox she couldn't escape. Ethan's father reached out and apologized to both of us, saying he'd had no idea about the test and was horrified by his wife's actions. He said he'd seen controlling and testing behavior before, but had always rationalized it as maternal protectiveness rather than recognizing the manipulation. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Judith showed up at my apartment unannounced. I answered the door to find her standing there perfectly composed, no trace of the confused elderly woman she'd been performing. She asked if we could talk privately, and I let her in, curious what angle she'd try next. Judith sat in my living room and said she'd been reflecting on everything that had happened. She acknowledged that her methods had been extreme and had backfired catastrophically. She said she'd been operating from a place of fear rather than love, terrified of losing her son to someone who might not treat him well or who might separate him from his family. She said watching me care for her with patience and genuine kindness while believing she was truly ill had actually proven I was exactly the kind of person she'd hoped Ethan would find. The irony was that her test had worked perfectly. I demonstrated character and commitment under pressure, but the test itself had been so unethical that it destroyed the relationships it was meant to protect. I asked why she thought a test was necessary at all, why she couldn't just trust her son's judgment. She sat in silence for a long moment before admitting she'd been tested by her own mother-in-law in similar ways and had internalized the belief that evaluation and surveillance were normal aspects of family formation. She said her mother-in-law had made her life miserable for years with constant tests and loyalty checks, and Judith had eventually proven herself worthy of acceptance. She thought she was being protective by applying the same standards, not realizing she was perpetuating an abusive pattern across generations. I pointed out that surviving abuse didn't make you qualified to inflict it on others, that recognizing harmful patterns meant stopping them rather than passing them forward. Judith said she understood that now, that therapy was helping her see how damaged her concept of family loyalty had become. She asked if there was any possibility of reconciliation with Gregory and Ethan, whether she could earn back their trust. I told her honestly that trust was earned through consistent behavior over time, not through apologies and promises. She'd shown everyone the depths she'd sink to for control, and now she'd need to demonstrate sustained change before anyone would believe in her transformation.